So our next speaker, Rasha Al Aqeedi, she actually arrived, was it this morning? It just, all the days seem so blurred. She literally got here this morning, went into a parliament meeting, and now she's here. Rasha I got acquainted with on Twitter. She's amazing. She's an Iraqi analyst and researcher, editor of the platform Irfa Saltak, and fellow at the Center for Global Policy. Rasha.
Thank you, Maryam. Thank you, everyone. Is this working? Okay. So, I was born in Mosul, Iraq. Mosul is a city well known to have been under ISIS control for several years. I get that reaction every time someone knows where I'm from. We're trying now to disassociate that connection, rebuild the city. But let's talk a little bit about Mosul. Mosul is perhaps Iraq's most conservative city. So imagine growing up as a young woman there, where your value and your importance is based on one thing: can you find a husband or not? I kid you not, that's literally how it is, or how it was in Mosul. I personally wanted more. And the pursuit of chasing my dreams and ambitions, I was scorned, laughed at, ridiculed. And then there's another thing called aib. Aib, which basically means shame. Aib culture is very big in Iraq, Middle East in general. I would say in Mosul in particular, it's a very a significant definition of the character of the city. But what does aib actually mean? It means aib is anything that a woman chooses to do outside what community and society has determined for her. Because in our region, unfortunately, women do not own their own person. They don't own even their own bodies. It belongs to society and it belongs to our family. And breaking free from that is actually my story. And this is how my story begins. I was very attracted to politics and public policy in particular because I felt that that was the only thing I can do and engage in order to achieve change, if not for me, for the generations after. I didn't want younger women to have to feel the same way I did, denied opportunities and chances, denied the ability to travel in order to study abroad because women cannot study abroad alone. In 2009, I participated in an exchange program in the United States on public policy, and I began thinking how I can take that experience back. And explaining this to my family, they were not very welcoming with the idea because, again, politics and public policy is not the realm for women. 2 years later, tragedy stuck in my family when my one older cousin, who was always a role model to me and had been a candidate for Iraqi's parliament, was assassinated in Mosul by extremists, leaving behind 2 children. The word politics in general became kind of a taboo in our family. And I realized I had now a choice. I either stay and watch my dreams die and my ambitions die, or perhaps be killed, because I did receive a death threat anyway, working for the government very briefly. Or perhaps I need to leave the country temporarily at least, in order to actually actualize my dream, make them real, and perhaps serve my country and community from abroad. And that sounded at the time and felt like the logical decision. However, even that logical decision was not completely my own. Traveling and living alone, perhaps outside of the family home, is perhaps the biggest aib, the biggest shame in Mosul. And I was unable to do that without getting married first. Being married in order just to travel and live outside and achieve your dreams was a price that I had to pay. And I realized that I was still beholden to someone and I still had to answer. But I persisted. I moved to the United Arab Emirates. Career-wise, I was doing great. I flourished. I began writing on Mosul at the time that ISIS took over the city, being one of the very few born and raised in the city who speak English and also was a woman. I got to travel and I got to talk about the city. And I offered the minute details of the community, something that lacks in a lot of the analysis that we hear today. And I spoke about the city, my hometown, with passion that lacks in a lot of the coverage that we see, not just about Mosul, about the region in general. Unfortunately, many researchers, analysts, they just kind of exploit the opportunity of the tragedy in our region and project their own analysis. But my life still, from different angles, was quite turbulent. On one hand, my mother and father were still under ISIS control in Mosul. They were living there for a whole year. I had to be careful what I said and did in order not to endanger them. At home, life became harder because my constant traveling and my success was a threat to the insecurity of my then partner. And I realized that I needed to make another decision. I needed also this time to leave. And again, this time I was freeing from my own security, my own safety, and my own well-being. Wars can happen at home too. Focusing on my work, I researched a lot about Iraq's communities and the details that are, again, not that we don't hear about. So the very micro-level details. And that was our work at Irfa Sotek, which means raise your voice, which is based in Virginia in the United States. We tried to focus on how these communities and societies cope with war, with devastation, destruction, but we shed it in a positive light. And that has been the work that I've been doing there since 2018. But something was different in 2019. There were no more positive stories to highlight. They all dried up. The younger generation was angry and was pessimist. And it was very, very strange because their anger resonated differently than the anger that we usually would see. They were angry at the entire system. This was a generation that, yes, grew up under US bombs in 2003 during the invasion, but it was also a generation that understood at least freedom more than my generation. They had some sense of democracy, even though they were not convinced that democracy with electoral boxes was enough. There was rampant corruption, nepotism, sectarianism, exploitation of religion and politics, and they wanted to change that. And they expressed it in a way of a generation that Iraq had not witnessed. In September 2019, after months of sporadic but small protests, one incident happened that ignited what we can call a fire that has not been tamed. A young woman was protesting and was attacked by water cannon, and people saw her body being swept. Now, she survived, but she was angry. The young man protesting said, "Hold on, is this not Aib? Or is Aib just a woman's body and her decisions and choices in life? Is it okay to spray a woman like this and watch her suffer, but it's not okay for her to travel?" October 1st was set as the date that they would express this anger peacefully. And when October 1st came and thousands took to the streets, Iraqi forces killed 3 protesters by 3 p.m. By the next morning, the number of protesters had quadrupled, hundreds of thousands were on the street, and Iraq's younger generation had begun their own revolution. Since then, over 700 young men have been killed. There are a lot of parallels between the protests in Iraq and Lebanon. Anger at foreign intervention, particularly that of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But what lacks in Lebanon, unfortunately, is very persistent in Iraq and present, and that is the number of those killed. Over 700 have died so far. Hundreds have been tortured. Over 30,000 injured, some of them injured for life, with disabilities now. Hundreds have been forced into silence via intimidation and threats, and tens are still kidnapped. We don't know where they are. We have not heard on them. However, they are still in the streets, right now, even as we speak. And there was a new angle also to this protest that was very new to Iraq, and that's the angle of she, because just as he persisted and they persisted, she persisted too. So in the first few weeks of the protests, from October 1st to October 12th, only a few women could be seen within the venues. And then there was a 2-week period where the religious ceremony of Ashura started in Iraq, so they took a break for protesting. And on October 17th, when the protest in Lebanon, as we just heard from Luna, happened, there was some kind of positive enviness on behalf of Iraqi women. They saw their Lebanese sisters taking to the streets and proud and lead the movement. And they said, you know what, when these protests resume on October 25, we will be there. We will be in the front lines with our brothers. And this time, the older generation could not contain this new movement, and they did also not understand. It has been absolutely amazing watching these changes in Iraq society, watching these women side by side with their brothers. They have been the medics, the paramedics, They have been cooking, and they have been in the front lines, facing the tear gas and the live bullets, and they stay there. It has been 4 months, going on to 5 months, and it shows no sign of slowing down. They want a complete overhaul in the political system, something that's based on integrity and real values of liberty and real values of democracy. I have been absolutely captivated by these protests. They have become pretty much my life purpose. I've returned to Iraq since only once. Unfortunately, have not been able to go to Tahrir Square. I hope I can in the near future. This is a moment I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. And I have not been on Earth so long, to be honest, but still, I never thought I'd see this even by the time if I live to 80. Let's say that's too ambitious, actually. So they are still here, in the streets, in Tahrir Square in Baghdad, in the protest venues in South Iraq and Basra, in Najaf and Karbala, the most conservative cities, women, outspoken. They're attacking the clergy. They're calling them out on their nonsense, on their hypocrisy. And this is something that politicians will have to reckon with, even if these protests do not achieve the political goals and aims that they want to. Because as we know, when you're from the Middle East and there's a revolution, it usually ends with a lot of tears. But even if that happens, what this generation has achieved is a victory in itself. They are changing and rewriting the history of Iraq, and even though the arc of history is long, I am very, very proud to see it happen. My only request from you all is to follow these protests, follow this generation. They are the founding fathers of modern Iraq. Thank you.